Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with another lecture on the series, I would say that this is the third lecture in the series, that is on the cinema and censorship. Under this very topic, we discussed lots of regulations on the Indian cinema, and today also we are going to carry forward our this session by discussing more on the cinema and censorship. We would be discussing from now, from 1935 onwards, and would be discussing particularly on the cinema and the censorship. And for this we have again with us in our studios Dr. Manoj Sharma. Dr. Sharma is assistant professor in Kirodimal College, University of Delhi, and he is assistant professor in the Department of History. So dear friends, let's try to understand from him what regulations were imposed on the cinema from 1935 onwards. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you.
As we have discussed a lot on the cinema and censorship, what were the major changes which took place after 1935 onwards? So over to you, sir.
Thank you. A very good morning to all the viewers. Continuing from the earlier two lectures in which we discussed the origins of censorship in the context of press, and thereafter how censorship was imposed on cinema from 1912-13 onwards during the silent era, which continued till 1931, and then with the arrival of the first talkie Alam Ara, how the British censorship authorities, they tried to censor the films which were produced in India. The censorship policy, as we have discussed earlier, was politically inspired. It was many a times arbitrary and also cynical in nature. The kind of references which were there with regard to the national movement or the revolutionary impulses, as well as the democratic impulses which came from America, they were largely rejected by the censors. As censors, they feared that cinema can be used as an instrument of propaganda by the people, those who were leading the nationalist movement. And at the same time, many of the people, those who were associated with cinema, were also well aware of the kind of prevailing situation in India, how the national movement was one of the important undercurrents as well as one of the foremost issues which was there in Indian history at that time. So what we see is that from 1935, which we have discussed earlier, and from 1935 onwards, what we see is that the coming of the Government of India Act in 1935, in which a number of measures were undertaken and elections also ensued. And in 1937, when elections were held, at that time Congress was able to gain majority in many of the provinces. And when Congress gained a majority in all these provinces, Congress was much liberal within the context of censorship. So British, they were not able to exert that kind of pressure during those 28 months of Congress rule within the context of censorship, because the Indian masses or the Congress rule in those provinces, they were in favor of free expression in some context. But what happens when unilaterally British, they decide that Indians, they will be with them in the Second World War, they will fight along with them, and they did not seek any consent of the Congress in this context or any other political party, but Congress was the most dominant political party at that time, and when their permission or their consent was not sought, the Congress ministries in various provinces, they in a way resigned. So this was the background in which all these activities they were undergoing. What we see is that during this particular period, what the government was trying, it was trying to appease the Congress in some way. Before the government before the government unilaterally decided that the government of India will support their war efforts. So during this particular period before 1939, what we see is that during 1937, a number of documentaries or the topicals, which they were known as topicals, which were banned for political reasons, they were now allowed so that they could be seen. And the Journal of Motion Picture Society of India, it documents that around 15 topicals or the documentaries, they were being released, and many of them, they were associated with Mahatma Gandhi as well. what we see is that a number of documentaries, they were made on various projects which were undertaken by Mahatma Gandhi, and many of these films, they were being banned by the censors, so that the propaganda use of these films could not be undertaken. Gandhi's popularity during this particular period was on continuous rise, not only in India but also in the foreign press, and his activities were covered in large numbers. In many of the foreign news agencies, they were also covering Mahatma Gandhi, and the documentaries or the topicals which were made on Gandhi, they were being banned in India. And these documentaries, they reflected Gandhi's charisma and popularity as a leader, and how cinema could also be used as an instrument of propaganda for India's struggle for independence. So this was one important aspect which was associated with the Gandhian movement, which began in 1917 onwards, and which carries on in the non-cooperation movement in 1920, civil disobedience movement in 1930, and the Quit India movement in 1942. So these were the three major important movements which were led by Mahatma Gandhi, and how Mahatma Gandhi's popularity was dominant during this particular period. And because of his popularity, because of Gandhi's popularity, government became in a way fearful of the kind of propaganda which will reach to the masses. So in this way, many of the films which were in a way banned earlier, which were rejected or censored by the colonial authorities, they were in a way released in 1937 so as to appease the Congress in some way. And thereafter in 1939, when the Congress ministries, they resigned in protest of unilateral decision of the colonial government that India will participate in the war with them. So this made the kind of censorship more and more stringent, because the government now realized that they will not be able to seek the support of the Congress. So that way they wanted that the censorship should be more and more strict in nature. So what we see is in the films during the Second World War, that there are a lot of references to the various symbols and ideals of the freedom struggle. In many of the films which we have discussed earlier as well in our last lectures, the scenes, dialogues and the songs, there are numerous references to the issue of freedom. Freedom was paramount, and Congress was fighting for the cause of freedom, and they wanted that India should be able to achieve independence in some way. The Gandhian methods were largely non-violent in nature. They were following the issue of ahimsa. So many of the films, they were dealing with that aspect which was related to ahimsa. The portrayal of Gandhi in some way in many of the films which we have discussed earlier also, like Bhakti Vidur, which was made in 1921 and which was censored by the colonial authorities. Then Reth, which was the film which was made in 1931. Then another film called Brandy Ki Bottle, which was made in 1939. Many of the films which were talking about issues of Hindu-Muslim unity, like a film called Padosi, which was made by V. Shantaram. So all these films, they were talking about certain aspects which were most importantly associated with the national movement. Another important aspect was the removal of untouchability. A number of films called Achut Kanya and Achut, they were dealing with these kind of issues. Apart from that, there was a novel which was written by Mulk Raj Anand with the title of Untouchable, and how Gandhi gave his inputs in this novel, that how Mulk Raj Anand, he stayed in one of the Gandhian ashrams, and Gandhi, when he read the script, he suggested some of the changes, and how these kind of changes were incorporated in this novel, which is considered to be one of the classics which was written in the 20th century. So from this perspective, we see that the ideals of the national movement, they were seen in many of the films. Then the prohibition of liquor, which was an important consideration during the national movement as well, and women, they participated in large numbers with regard to the campaigns which were led with regard to the prohibition of liquor, and Brandy Ki Bottle was one of the films in which this issue was tackled, in which Gandhi's popularity could be seen in many of the songs in which villagers, they are saying that Gandhi's Raj has come and we should not be fearful now. And at the same time they think that Gandhi is some sort of a saint or a Mahatma or some sort of a god who is going to remove the British from Indian land. So these kind of rumors with regard to Gandhi, they also played an important role, that Gandhi had all those kind of supernatural or magical powers with which the kind of problems with which India was afflicted would be cured. Then the ideas of democracy and the ideas of Congress, they were also reflected in many of the films. So all these films, they were making a pitch for national independence, many of them, and this is how the colonial censors treated them, and in a way tried to cut many of the scenes and dialogues which were associated with the national movement. At the same time, the use of allegory in many of the films during this particular period. What we see is that Congress symbols like charkha, etc., they were being shown in many of the films. Photographs and portraits of Gandhi, Nehru and Subhash Bose, they were also shown in many films in the background, and the presence of the Congress flag could also be seen in this particular period. So what we see is that in many of the films, even though they were not directly related to the national movement, they might be out and out commercial films, but even in those films we see that certain symbols they are being used which are relevant to the national movement. I would like to cite an example of a film called Kismat, which was made in 1943, in which Ashok Kumar played the lead role. It was out and out commercial film. What we see in this film is that there is a story in which there is nothing to do with the national movement, but there is a song, आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है, दूर हटो ए दुनिया वालों हिंदुस्तान हमारा है. So in the background what we see is that there is a map of India in which Bharat Mata is shown, and then this is the only connection in the film where a song is related to the national movement. One of the lyrics of the song says that तुम न किसी के आगे झुकना, जर्मन हो या जापानी. So the reference ostensibly is for the Germans and the Japanese, but at the same time, to hoodwink the censorship authorities, the reference was to the British as well. So this was, when this film was released, it was a blockbuster, and when this film became quite popular and this film was shown in the cinema halls, a number of people in the audience, they requested to play this song again and again. So the government came to know about this incident, that why this kind of song is being played and again and again. So an inspector was sent to view the film so that he can submit a report. So inspector called Dharmendra Gaur was sent to investigate the issue, and when he investigated, he could realize that there was directly a reference to the British, but when he submitted the report, he said that there was nothing wrong in the song because the reference is made to the Germans and the Japanese. And when this kind of report was submitted, British, they accepted the report. But what we see is that the censorship authorities were being hoodwinked by the people, those who were associated with the film. And this song was written by poet Pradeep, who was writing for many other films as well. He had written a number of songs. And this is how this song was seen. And in one of the references, the song was also referring to the national unity as well. When you hear the whole song, there is a cry, there is a pitch for communal harmony which should be maintained in India, specifically in the context of 1943, when the demands for Pakistan were made by the Muslim League, and it was suggested the two nation theory in which India and Pakistan, they had to be divided. The Muslim League was making a lot of pitch for it, and the government was also supporting them in some way for the division of India. And later we see also that how India and Pakistan, they got separated in 1947. Then when we see in the context of the reaction of the censor board, we can see that censors, they were recognizing many of the themes, many of the ideas, and they tried to cut them. The General of the Film Industry in February 1944, it remarked that the excision of photographs of Congress leaders is not going to remove them from the heart of their followers. So what we see is that when the Journal of the Film Industry, which was published in 1944, it was claiming that even when British, they were trying to erase or omit the memories of the Congress leaders, the people, they will not forget their leaders in any way, because their memories are in their hearts. So how cinema industry was also making some contribution to the national movement, however little it was very important in this context. In the Second World War, what we see is that British government, when it involved India without consulting them, and the Viceroy assumed a number of powers which were associated, which were concerning during this particular period in the context of defense of India rules. And when the government government promulgated a number of policies, Congress was dissatisfied with these kind of policies and resigned from the government. So government assumed a number of draconian powers, and it imposed all kinds of censorship in this in an intensified form. So what we see is that when Congress resigned during this particular period, the kind of authority which was exercised by the colonial authorities, they got more and more dominant, and they realized that when they will be able to control all the propaganda machinery which was at the disposal of the people, those who were fighting on behalf of nationalism, or the people those who are called as nationalists, then they will be able to throttle the nationalist aspirations. So what we see is that the Quit India movement, which was launched in 1942, it instigated a sense of revolutionary spirit among the masses, and a number of major leaders like Gandhi and others, they were arrested by the government. So the obnoxious censorship policy of the British government or the colonial government, so that the ideals of the national movement may not reach the masses, was unleashed. So what we see is that in May 1942, the government restricted length of feature films to only 11,000 feet and of trailers to 400 feet. So what the government was trying was that the government was asking the filmmakers, that these filmmakers, those who were associated with making films in India, they were given certain kind of licenses. And when these filmmakers, those who have proven their worth in making films earlier, so they were being given licenses by the government, and at the same time they were restricting the length of feature films as well. So when the length of feature film was restricted, when trailers were restricted, they were also asked to produce certain films which were known as the war propaganda films. The British, they wanted Indian filmmakers or producers to make those films in which the British war efforts, they could be supported. One of the important films which was made under this category was Dr. Courtney's Ki Amar Kahani by V. Shantaram. Dr. Courtney's Ki Amar Kahani was a film which was dealing with a medical mission which was sent from India to China during the later part of 1930s. And in this medical mission, there was one doctor known as Dr. Courtney's who was sent from India. So the film was a war effort film in this sense, that how British, they were getting support from the Indians as well. And British censor authorities, they were promulgating certain laws, they were making certain rules, so that the Indians, they are able to support them in the various ventures which were led by the Indians, by the British. In July 1943, what we see is that a strict embargo is placed on the production of new films and making of new prints of the duly certified pictures, except under license from the government. So on that basis, licenses were given to each producer, and their past performances, they were taken into account when these people, they were given licenses. And it was also suggested that every third film which they will make will be on an approved subject. So the approved subject will be approved from the government, and under the Defense of India rules, exhibition of 200 feet of approved film was compulsory for every exhibition, and rental was also charged for these kind of films. So what we see is that the government was trying to place a number of a number of rules and regulations on the Indian producers and filmmakers, and they had to adhere to these kind of regulations which were being placed on them. So government was very wary that the filmmakers may try to exploit cinema in some way in propagating the ideas of nationalism. At the same time, they may not support the war efforts of the government. So they placed certain legal restrictions on them so that they are able to follow the kind of policies which they wanted to follow. So in that context, the director of the war publicity, he was put on the censor board that films they would not contain anything which was working against the war efforts. So this was one of the important issues which would be tackled by the director of the war publicity. What we see is in February 1943 is that the government it established Information Films of India, or IFI, for which exclusive production of newsreels and documentaries will take place. And these newsreels and documentaries will support the cause of the government. It will support the war efforts of the government, so that the morale of the armed forces it will be boosted in some way. What we see is that British, they were trying to throttle the nationalist aspirations, and they were trying to use cinema or films as an instrument of propaganda to propagate their colonial policies. So this was one issue which was there in the mind of the government, and the government was taking various steps so that the war efforts of the government were on the right track, and they were able to secure the support of Indian masses, so that they are able to succeed in the kind of war which was waged against the Nazi rule, against Germany as well as Italy. And in this effort of the Allied forces, in which Britain and France and later America also joined them, they were successful as well when Britain was able to defeat the Nazi forces. So what we see is that many of the films during this particular period, they bore the brunt of censors' scissors. And Feroz Rangoonwala, one of the important film historians, he says that All India Radio was not allowed to carry a line in which reference to Mahatma Gandhi road was made. So many of the roads which were named after Mahatma Gandhi, even reference to Mahatma Gandhi road was not allowed during this particular period, that it will also in some way popularize Gandhi. And on the screen you can see that I have mentioned two films. One is Amar Asha, which was made in 1942, and another is Preetham, which was again made in 1942. And in both the films, some kind of omissions are taking place. For example, in film called Amar Asha, where two servants are talking to the hero, in which they are talking about the hero and they are referring to the anti-war views. So these kind of scenes, they were being removed, because British, they were in favor of the war, and they did not want that any of the dialogues which are referring to the anti-war views, they should be forwarded to the audience in any way. In the other film which you can see on the screen, Preetham, which was made, there is a comparison between Hitler and Mahatma Gandhi. So in this, reference to Gandhi is made. So this was also not acceptable to the colonial authorities, that how Gandhi was being shown in all these kind of films. Gandhi himself was so popular among the masses, and masses, they were ready to sacrifice their lives for Gandhi, as we can see the various movements which he launched. Even in the Quit India movement, what we see is that Quit India movement, in that movement some violence is also used, and Gandhi was not against violence. Gandhi was against violence, and Gandhi was not in favor of violence. But during this particular period of Quit India movement, Gandhi said that he was not ready to suspend this kind of movement, because this kind of movement in which violence was being used, because this violence was nothing in comparison to the violence which was unleashed by the state or by the government. So government was not in any way ready to propagate the ideals of Gandhi. It was not ready to popularize Gandhi in any way. So not only documentaries which were made on Gandhi by various agencies, the kind of feature films which were made on Gandhi, the kind of feature films in which references to Gandhi were made, or references to the national movement were made. They were not liked by the colonial or the censorship authorities. Another two films which I would like to talk about, one film was Raja, which was made in 1943, and another film was Naya Tarana, again 1943. Both these films, again what we see is that references are made to Gandhi and to the Congress, and we see that the Raja or the prince or the ruler is in a way giving salute to Mahatma Gandhi's statue, and Raja is making some kind of preference for Hindi as against English language. So these kind of ideas which were not in a way conducive to the colonial rule, they were rejected by the censorship authorities. And in another film called Naya Tarana, there is a reference in which a dialogue says that take by force the thing you need, for this is not the age to ask for something before taking it. So this kind of dialogue is basically a revolutionary dialogue which is asking that we should snatch things, and in this age one should not ask for things. So these kind of references in which people are in a way inspired to take the revolutionary measures in which they should not ask for things, rather they should snatch those things. So the question of independence was paramount in those times. So the reference is generally being made that we should snatch our independence. So these kind of references they were being made in these films. Another important films in 1940s, there was a film called Sangam which was made in 1943. There was a film called Gajbahu which was made in 1944. So in these films you see that references are made to Subhash Chandra Bose, and references to Mahatma Gandhi ki Jai are made in this film. Another film was Gajbahu, which was showing India in chains. So all these kind of portrayals or depictions, they were being asked to be removed, and many of the words they were also being asked. For example, Bhuke Mare Bengal can die of hunger, Vande Mataram, Inqilab Zindabad, Akhand Hindustan, in which references are made for India to be united, where references are being made to long live the revolution, references are being made hail to the motherland. So all these kind of ideas which were talking about the revolutionary impulse of the masses, where nation was in some way deified or being in a way praised by the people, that was being excised or removed from the films by the censorship authorities in 1940s as well. So these kind of things we see in this particular period. There was another film called Chandni, in which you see that portrait of national leaders, they were being shown, and how what we see is that promotion of education was also propagated, and national leaders, they were also being supported. Another film called Hamara Desh, which was made in 1939. Another banned film was Dheeraj, which was made in 1942. So all these films, they were seen as some sort of a Congress propaganda films, that how Congress was trying to propagate its ideology, how Congress was trying to propagate the kind of flags or the symbols which were associated with the national movement, which were associated with their party. So such kind of deletions, they take place during this particular period, which we see in a number of films during this particular period. And another important, some of the important films which were made during this particular period were the stunt films. And these stunt films, in which Wadia and Nadia, they were the important people. Wadia, JBH Wadia and Homi Wadia, they made these films, they were the producers of these films. And Nadia's name was Mary Evans, who was from Austrian Welsh origin, and Nadia became quite popular in Indian cinema, and she was known as, a number of films were made with Nadia Hunterwali, Diamond Queen, etc., Tufan Mail, and all these films, they were advocating the victory of good over evil. What we realized that many of these films, which were the stunt films, which were catering to the Mufassil areas or the rural areas, they were talking about certain issues which were quite relevant to the national movement of that particular period. The kind of issues they were talking about they were relevant in this context, that they were talking about the victory of good over evil, and British, they were considered to be evil in that context, and Indians, they were representing the forces of the good, and how in the end good will succeed over evil. This was shown in these kind of films which were made, which were largely some sort of action films of today's times. They had a number of stunts, the kind of techniques which were being used at that particular period. They were focusing on the various aspects which were relating to democracy, in which the protagonist and the antagonist, they are talking to each other, and pitch for democracy is being made in these kind of films. They were saying that good governance was an important issue, and how British, they were not able to govern Indians. So the focus of these stunt films was on democracy, was on good governance. They were also talking about justice, which was not being given to the Indian masses. So all these kind of films, when they were being shown in the Mufassil or rural areas, people, they were able to relate them with the colonial rule, that how during the colonial rule these kind of issues, they were being absent, how the colonial rule was autocratic in nature, how colonial rule was devoid of democracy, how colonial rule was not giving them any kind of justice, rather they were being fed with all kind of injustices, the kind of racial policy which was being followed by the British, in which Indians, they were considered to be inferior, how the racial policy of the British, in which they were saying that it was the white man's burden to civilize the natives or the Indians, how Indians, they were not being allowed to go on higher salary, they could not secure the higher positions in the army and the civil services. So all these kind of injustices which were there for the Indians, they were not liked, and these were being promoted in all these kind of stunt films which were making a pitch for freedom of speech and expression as well. One important film which I would like to talk about was Sikandar of Sohrab Modi. Sikandar was made in 1941, and it was passed by censor authorities, but it was later uncertified for theatres in army cantonments, because it was making an appeal to freedom and nationalism, and it was considered to be too provocative. When references are being made, when discussion is going on between Sikandar or Alexander and Porus, and after the war, then Porus makes references that he should be treated like a king, and all his possessions are returned by Sikandar or Alexander. But when these kind of portrayals were shown to the masses, how masses became aware of the ideas of freedom and nationalism, that was seen by the colonial authorities, and they felt that these kind of films, they should not be shown in the army cantonment areas, because the soldiers, they will be inspired by all these kind of references, in which references are made for freedom and nationalism. So these kind of references which were shown in some of the films which were dealing with the issues of dealing with many of the issues which are related to the national movement in the stunt films of those times. Prithvi Vallabh was another film, an important stunt film which was made during this particular period, and how the titles of these stunt films were provocative in nature. Baghi Sipahi or a rebellious soldier, this was one title which you can find in many of the stunt films which were made. Then how many of the films dealing with the title of Desh Deepak, which was another title of a film, and how these titles, they were also very provocative in nature. Many of the films they tried to hoodwink censor authorities, as I discussed earlier as well, that how Aaj Himalay ki choti se fir humne lalkara hai. This kind of reference was made in a film called Kismat, which I have already talked about, and there was another film called Apna Ghar, which was also using allegory for India's non-violent struggle for freedom. So this film called Apna Ghar was making some kind of cause for change of heart by peaceful means, in which leading to the triumph of the meek. So this kind of effort was also made by Mahatma Gandhi, who believed in this kind of philosophy that we should give every chance to our enemy so that they can have a change of heart. So these kind of ideas, they were being reflected in many of the films of this particular period, and how the censorship authorities, they were being hoodwinked by the Indian filmmakers in some way, so that their sentiments and their ideas, they reach the masses in some disguised form. As all the political films, they were being rejected by the censorship authorities. So what we see in this particular period during the Second World War is the change from the studio system to the star system. What we see is that number of people, they were able to make quick money during the Second World War, and this quick money was in the form of black money. And when this black money came to the people, those who were from trading community, they did not know where to invest this kind of money. So they thought, why not to invest in films? So earlier there was a studio system in which hero, heroines and other technicians, they were on the payrolls of the studios. But now in the star system, these people, those who had huge amounts of money, they approached filmmakers, producers, music directors, hero and heroines, and to do their own films, in which they offered a lot of money to them so that they work in their films. And what happens is that in 1940s, because of this arrival of lot of money, a star system emerges. And in this star system, stars, they become more important. If they say that they are going or they are willing to do this film, then you have financiers to back them. And this kind of a star system is evident in late 90s as well, that you have big stars. This continues over a period of time, and only later part of 90s and early part of 21st century, we see that many of the big studios also came, like Yash Raj, UTV, etc., in which they are making a number of films. But even then, these big studios, they also rely in many of their films on big stars as well. So this kind of system, it continued from 1940s, it emerged in 1940s and continued thereafter. I would like to also point out certain South Indian films, in which one film was Manas Samrakshanam, In Defense of Honor, a Tamil film made in 1944 by K. Subramaniam. And there was also a reference in this film that go away to the Japanese. And this film was also echoing the same song which we have talked about earlier of Kismat. But at the same time, there was also a reference to the Quit India movement. Dur hato hai duniya walo, Hindustan hamara hai. So Quit India reference was also reference that British, they should quit India in that sense. So another film by the same director was Tyag Bhumi, which was made in 1939. Gautam Kaul, he has worked on this kind of aspect which was relating the national movement to the films, and he says that, I would like to quote him, the audience response to its symbolic interpretation was so wildly enthusiastic that the Madras district magistrate ordered the confiscation of the film print immediately. So what we see is that all these kind of films which were referring to not only the Hindi films, but the films which were made in South India as well, these kind of references which are made with regard to the national movement, they were being seized by the people, those who were associated with the censorship authorities. So they were not in any way liked by the censorship authorities. And at the same time, the British changing equation with other countries was another important aspect during this particular period, that many of the films which were being released by the colonial authorities in India, they were later rejected by the colonial authorities, or vice versa. There are many of the films which are not in any way certified or are released by the colonial authorities earlier, they were being shown to the Indian people later. So this kind of trend was taking place, keeping in mind how were the colonial authorities' relations with other countries were existing at that particular moment. In this context, I would like to make a reference to a film called Chetniks, which was made in 1943, and this film was about an anti-Nazi rebel, which was operating in Yugoslavia. And this film was later banned when British they started giving support to Tito during the war. So the government of India, it tried to justify its stand, that it says that the film was certified at a time when Chetniks were considered as pro-allies, and now they were not pro-allies, and that is why this film, it was rejected by the colonial authorities. There are other two examples apart from Chetniks, in which two news review shorts, they were entitled Philippines and Crisis in the Pacific, and these films, they were labeled as anti-Japanese in Bengal in 1940. But India House, it pointed out that the changes in the Britain's relations with Japan and these kind of changes which took place, and British authorities now they wanted to ignore Japanese sentiments, and they certified such anti-Japanese films later, in which Japan's designs in the Far East they were being shown. So what we see in this particular period is the relationship of Britain, which was changing during the war itself, because war period itself was a very long period from 1939 till 1945. We see that during these 6 years the war is taking place. So the relationship of Britain with other countries was an important point during this particular period, in which they decided to show or not to show film to the Indian masses. So these were the important concerns of the British during this particular period, and how their concerns also change with their change in the equations with other nations as well. This is what we see during this particular period. What also happens is that Gandhi was not a supporter of films in some way. Gandhi rejected the idea of watching films, and there was only one film which was seen by Gandhi during his whole lifetime, which was Ram Rajya, which was made by Vijay Bhatt in 1943. So what we see is that it is very ironic in nature that Gandhi, who was a hero of so many topicals or documentaries, Gandhi, whose ideas they were being reflected in so many films of this particular period, he himself was not in favor of watching films. He considered that cinema itself was a vice. Cinema was an evil in that sense, that it was the young people, they were going astray because of the kind of films which were being made. So what we see is that whenever some kind of request was being made to Gandhi that he should send some kind of message to the film fraternity, or whether he should see some of the films which were championing the cause which was championed by Gandhi as well, the issue of Hindu-Muslim unity, the issue of national movement, the issue of untouchability, the issue of emancipation of women. So all these kind of films should be seen by Gandhi. As K. Abbas, a filmmaker, he was a journalist as well with Bombay Chronicle, and later he turned into a filmmaker, made a film called Dharti Ke Lal in 1946. He was a script writer for Shri 420, Awara, and he also made a film called Munna. So many of the films made by K. Abbas, who had this communist bent of mind, and who also belonged to IPTA, Indian People's Theatres Association. So all these people, they were making some kind of an urge to Mahatma Gandhi to watch films, and K. Abbas himself wrote a letter to Gandhi. It was an open letter in which he says that cinema was not all that bad, and Mahatma Gandhi should come and watch films, and he should identify also if there are any problems with regard to cinema, then they can be taken care of by the film industry as well. But Gandhi did not reply to this open letter, and at the same time he never sent any kind of congratulatory messages to the various requests he received in his lifetime, to the various offers made to him to send any messages. And Gandhi only saw one film which in his own lifetime, which was Ram Rajya. And Gandhi's popularity was there in the films, and one of the members called J.T. Horn in 19 1944 he made a reference that films, they should refrain from making a hero of Gandhi. There should not be many references to Gandhi in the films. This is what the reference is made. Then he also says that Indian events and personalities, they should not be shown on the screen time and again. So these people, they were in a way fearful of the kind of presentations on the Indian screen, that all these presentations will in a way propagate the cause of the national movement. So they say that these kind of leaders, they should not be overdone in future, they should not be shown time and again on the screen, and these kind of concerns were raised during this particular period. Another important leader was S. Satyamurthy, who tried to use cinema during this particular period. What we see is that a number of films, they were being made by Satyamurthy, and in the Congress campaign for the elections, a number of documentaries were made by Satyamurthy, and he was one important leader who believed that the impact of moving images could be used for the propaganda purposes. And he also made a propaganda film in Madras before the elections of provincial legislatures, but it was rejected by the censors. So what we see is that not only in northern part of India, but also in southern part of India, this kind of awareness about the usage of cinema as an instrument of propaganda was seen during this particular period, and they were making a number of efforts in this regard. And S. Satyamurthy was one important leader of Congress who was making an effort for this particular cause. What we see is that the issues of sensuality and morality, they were being rejected by the censors, and censors felt that if you see many of the film posters of the earlier period, that issues which were related to sex and violence, they were not in any way not very central to the censorship policy. They were not in any way given some kind of importance that these kind of scenes, they should be removed, because censorship authority was largely political in nature, and in many of the films, all these kind of scenes which were catering to the passion, which were considered to be erotic in nature, they were being allowed to be shown to the masses. In many of the films, these kind of portrayals, they were being questioned by many of the people, those who were associated with the censor board. And Rameshwari Nehru, who was a freedom fighter and later who became a provincial minister in independent India, she makes a reference that she was a member of the Punjab provincial censor board, and in that she believes that the kind of images which were being shown, they were in way impacting the moral and the kind of culture we had, and these films, they should not be shown to the masses. So as you had already seen on the screen as well, she was not in favor of all these kind of portrayals which were there, and she questioned all these kind of portrayals. There was films called Throw of Dice, Karma, Light of Asia, and there was a film called Zarina by Sagar Movie Tone, in which all these kind of passionate scenes, they were being shown. So what we see in terms of impact is that Indian cinema was denied any kind of encouragement and protection by the colonial authorities. Indian cinema as an industry could not grow because there was no support from the British to Indian cinema as well. Then the censorship machinery which was being followed in India was very obnoxious in nature, which was some sort of an impediment to the Indian censors. In many of the films, some sort of pre-censorship could also be seen. Pre-censorship in the sense that there was a film called Congress Girl which was to be made, and when the people or the producers of the film, they went to the authorities and they said that we want to make this film which is talking about a girl who is earning her livelihood through spinning a charkha. So censor authorities told the producers that this film will not be allowed to be released in India, and they rejected such kind of portrayals. So what we see is that all these kind of portrayals, they were being rejected in the form of pre-censorship. As you can see on the screen that there was a lot of uncertainty after independence as well. And B.D. Garg, who is an important film historian who is talking about film criticism, you can see his quote as well, that there was a lot of confusion during this particular period when India became independent, and the people, those who were associated with the censorship, they became reactionary and rigorous, and they were more rigid during this particular period. And they were talking about in terms of moral and spiritual heritage, and many of the films, they were rejected on this ground, and the idea was to in a way destroy the dissent. So, as you can see the quote which is there on the screen. So, these kind of ideas, they were during this period. Now, after independence, what we see is that Film Enquiry Committee was instituted under the chairmanship of S.K. Patil, and this Film Enquiry Committee, it submitted a report in which films, they were being classified in U and A, and at the same time Central Board of Film Censors was also instituted during this particular period, in which this censor board, or CBFC, Central Board of Film Censors, was under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Government of India, and it was given this task of regulating the public exhibition of films under the provisions of Cinematograph Act 1952. So, Cinematograph Act came in 1952, and Cinematograph Act had to certify or censor the films, and only after the censorship by this board, films could be exhibited in India. And the kind of rules which came during this particular period, in 1983, Central Board of Film Censors, now it became the Central Board of Film Certification. So, what we see is that from Central Board of Film Censors in 1983, it becomes the Central Board of Film Certifications. Now, film, they were to be certified by the board. So, these kind of changes from 1952, when the Indian Cinematograph Act it comes, and it was to decide the rules, it was to decide about the rules, why the rules, how they will be applied, so that films, they were to be censored. So, now when we talk about the current classification of films, we see that films generally, they are classified into in 4 ways. One is U, or the unrestricted public exhibition, in which what we see is that it is suitable for all ages, but it should not upset children over 4 years of age. Another category is UA, in which parental guidance is required, in which all ages are admitted, but it is advised that children, those who are below 12, they should be accompanied by a parent, and because many of the contents may be considered intense or inappropriate for young children. 2 other categories are, one is adult category, in which only adult audiences who are 18 years or over. Nobody who is below the age of 18 should watch a film in cinema with this kind of rating. And 4th one is S, which is restricted to any special class of persons, for example doctors. So, this is generally the 4 ways in which films, they are being certified. The kind of certificates which are being given to the films, this is how the Central Board of Film Certification currently classifies film. And many a times we see that nowadays many of the films recently, they have been questioned by that how they have been classified into UA category, how they have been classified into U category, and because largely their content was they should have been given A certificate. So, these kind of debates, they are being discussed at different levels. I would like to talk about certain examples of 1970s as well. There was a film called Garm Hawa, which was made in 1973 by M.S. Satyu, which was talking about the issue of partition, and its release was held up for 8 months, what we see. And at the same time, there was a film called Andhi, made by Gulzar. It was talking about the personal striking resemblances to Indira Gandhi, and this film was subsequently released in 1977. It was not allowed to be released in 1975 when it was made, and when Janata Party came to power in 77, this film was released. There was an important film called Kissa Kursi Ka, made in 1977, and this film was a political spoof. It was banned by the Congress. Its film prints, they were being burnt by the people, those who were associated with the government, and none of the prints which are associated with Kissa Kursi Ka are available, and this film was not allowed at all to be shown to the masses. Another film of 1990s I would like to talk about is Bandit Queen. It was made in 1994, and it was banned temporarily by the Delhi High Court. And there was a film called Panch, which was made by Anurag Kashyap, and Panch was also banned because the kind of sex violence which was shown, the usage of drugs which was shown in this film. So this film was also banned. Few other examples are the same film by Anurag Kashyap called Black Friday, which was based on 1993 Bombay bombings. So this film was later released in 2007. And another film, Kaum De Heere, which was made in 2014, and it was glorifying the assassination of Indira Gandhi. It was again banned by the central government. So what we see is that this kind of censorship of films has been continuing. It has continued over a period of time, and many of the films, they have bore the brunt of censors' scissors, and there are new challenges to the censorship now. And these kind of new challenges are in the context that whether censorship should continue or it should not continue, whether censorship is necessary or it is not necessary, whether self-censorship should be there, people should be able to decide whether they want to continue with the, whether they want to those images, they will go and watch those images, whether they don't want to watch those images, they are going to reject those images. And the arrival of technology in the form of internet, mobile, social networking site and hidden cameras. So all these issues in which there was a film called India's Daughter, which was largely talked about, which was dealing with the Nirbhaya's rape, and this film was largely talked about, and how it came to YouTube, how it became available, how Indian government asked BBC to not to show the film, and despite that film was shown, and how technology is playing an important role. So when we come to retrospect that how we are going to view all those three lectures which we have discussed, we started from the colonial legacy and the Indian concerns during the colonial period, and in the post-independence period we talked about the Central Board of Film Censors, which converted into the Central Board of Film Certification. Various films we talked about which were controversial in nature, and finally we can say that the debate about censorship will continue because it is a never-ending debate. People those who are going to support it and the people those who are going to reject, they are there in every generation. So this is how I would like to end my lecture here. Thank you very much for the patience which you have shown.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for delivering such a nice lecture. Now, I would like to tell you all that if you want to access this particular lecture, you can access it with the help of YouTube. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.